Right. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, wherever you are. Welcome to the CDS Lab Research Coordination Network webinar series. I'm very happy to welcome our speaker, Dr. Shenandoah Billiot, and Professor Qingwen Chen will introduce our speaker today. Qingwen.
Hey, thank you, Cecilia. Hi, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, if you're coming from East. So I'm very honored to introduce my colleague at ASU, Dr. Shenandoah Billiot, and she is assistant professor of social work at Arizona State University. And prior to joining ASU, she was assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And Dr. Billiot is early career fellow at the Gulf Research Program through the National Academies and Science of Sciences, Medicine, and Engineering. And currently, she's serving as a technical advisor member of the Climate Change Task Force of the National Congress of American Indians. And her research has focused on exploring indigenous specific sensitivity to global climate change and the exposure to many pathways to social determinant of health outcomes, and with indigenous population and global to co-develop the adaptation activities. And she earned a PhD in social work from Washington University in St. Louis as a Henry Rowe Cloud Fellow at Yale University. And she has a master's in social work at the University of Michigan. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Billiot.
Thank you. Shenandoah, you have the floor now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I was trying to find the share button. So thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for introducing me to I also want to acknowledge that I appreciate everyone joining the second time, because the first time I was scheduled to speak, my internet was not working. So I really appreciate you coming back for this talk. I'm going to share my screen now. So I'll be talking about building community-based adaptations to address health implications of exposure to environmental changes. And before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the physical location of Arizona State University is located within the ancestral homelands of those American Indian tribes that have sustained connections to its lands and waters since time memorial, including Akamil Ahotham, Peepash, and Tohono O'odham peoples. So wherever you are on ancestral lands, ancestral homelands of an indigenous community. These lands carry memory through stories of struggle for survival and identity in the face of overwhelming colonizing power. And when we become aware of the pedagogy of the land, we begin to watch and listen to the stories of the land, so that way we may begin to heal the ruptures of the past. I would also like to acknowledge that my work, as mentioned, is funded by the Early Career Research Fellowship from the Gulf Research Program at National Academies of Science and Medicine and Engineering. And the content of this presentation today is solely the responsibility of me and my authors, and does not necessarily represent the official views of the Gulf Research Program of the NAS. So globally, about 22% of our land surface is managed, used, or owned by approximately 370 million indigenous peoples who live in about 70 countries and constitute about 5,000 separate groupings. This means that approximately 6% of the world's population maintains about 80% of our world's biodiversity. And so today, when I'm talking about indigenous peoples, I'm referring to peoples or nations who take their tribal identities as members of the human species from the landscapes and seascapes that gave them their unique tribal cultures. So although Indigenous peoples around the world contribute the least typically to changes in our environment, they are disproportionately affected by these changes due to at least three main reasons. First, Indigenous peoples are in close proximity to vulnerable ecosystems. Second, our social, spiritual, cultural, and traditional lifestyles are deeply reliant on the natural resources around us for subsistence and cultural practices. For example, many Indigenous peoples' creation stories are rooted in the physical environment. And finally, due to historical events, Indigenous peoples as a group are disproportionately among the poorest of their societies and have the greatest health disparities. And while these changes are felt differently among Indigenous peoples, they are consistent around the globe. So this work of exposure to environmental changes has led me to expand what is typically defined as social work. In social work, we've looked at post-disaster implications to health and mental health. However, disasters are typically acute onset and time delineated, usually ranging from a 3 to 36 month time frame. Whereas global environmental changes, meaning changes to our physical and biogeochemical environment caused either naturally or influenced by human activities, can include disasters, but it also includes long-term climatic change cycles like climate change, as well as human activities that directly cause disturbances among ecosystems like coastal erosion. And all of these changes have effects on biodiversity, water, ecosystems, and human health, as you guys know. And so my goal has been, since I started my work, to expand social work to understand this, this more chronic process of global environmental changes. For my population, specifically my tribal community, we are mostly concerned with coastal erosion. And so coastal Louisiana has lost an average of 34 square miles of land per year for the last now 70 years, from 1932 to present day. And that's over 1,900 square miles, which is about the size of the state of Delaware. And if nothing is done to further stop it, it is predicted that Louisiana will lose an additional amount about the size of the Baltimore and Washington, D.C. area. You can see here this outline of where our tribal community, United Houma Nation, is located. And you can see that the red is the color of the land that's already been lost. And the yellow mostly has been lost. So our tribal community is located in the parts of Louisiana where there has been the most land loss due to coastal erosion. This parish here, Terrebonne, which means good land, has lost about 61% of the total land loss in Louisiana. And so that makes it one of the most coastal, vulnerable counties in the United States. And so Terrebonne Parish is, city seat is called Houma, named after my tribe, United Houma Nation. And our coastal communities these coastal communities here in Louisiana are exposed to environmental risks that have impacted mental health, food security, water supply, and physical infrastructure. So I conducted my fieldwork, initial fieldwork from October 2015 to May 2016. It was fully funded by the Center for Social Development at Washington University. And I partnered with UHN Tribal Council and the Dulac Community Center pictured on the bottom. So I sought to understand what is the level of exposure to environmental changes and what is the level of negative health outcomes among United Houma Nation members. As a non-federally recognized tribe, we don't have a succinct or comprehensive healthcare system. And so levels of health outcomes and prevalence of non-communicable infectious diseases is not readily available. Second question I sought to ask, is there a relationship between self-reported exposure to environmental changes and health outcomes among Indigenous peoples? And then third, do Indigenous specific factors, risk and protective factors like connection to land, social support, historical trauma, and discrimination alter that relationship between exposure to environmental changes and health outcomes? So because of our limited time today, I'm not going to go into the theoretical framework that helped develop these questions, but I put up here two papers that I have worked with fellow Indigenous scholars to help develop this theoretical framework. And here's just the model of the questions that I asked. So you have a visual. So I did this in a mixed method study with the overall mixed methods question saying, how do shared cultural experiences among United Houma Nation members influence their perceptions of environmental changes? And so the first three aims are, as I mentioned, these questions through an interviewer administered survey in person. What a time, huh? And then aim 4 was semi-structured interviews through a phenomenological perspective of understanding of data collection and analysis. And then the fifth aim was to put them together in a true mixed method study. So my sample consisted, as my first study, only Terrebonne Parish. And so within the parish, of the 19,000 that members who live in Louisiana or in the 6th parish service area, about 7,700 live in Terrebonne Parish. And I recruited 160 members who were over 30, at least part of their income was through subsistence activities to participate in the study. And then from questions who are from those participants who answered having a strong ethnic identity and earning a majority of their income through subsistence activities, 20 agreed to participate in the phenomenological interviews. And I utilized measures that were previously validated with other Indigenous communities, with the exception of the environmental distress scale. And so this scale I had to significantly modify with my community advisory council, and I pilot tested it before conducting my research because the environmental distress scale was created in Australia for predominantly white communities experiencing drought and implications of drought. And so quite different from my population and what I was looking to study. So I pilot tested the questions and then conducted an EFA following data collection. So here's just some overall results. The average age of participants was 55. A little less than half were female. About 3/4 were married. About 1/4 were had a high school degree as their highest level of education completed, and more than half spoke Houma French as their first language. Houma French is our first colonized language from obviously from the French. And the Houma French dialect has many of our original words, which are similar to Choctaw language, that's mixed in with the French language. And almost 40% attended what's called Indian schools during the times of segregation, where our ancestors were not allowed to go to neither white nor Black schools. And so there's a slight anomaly in this last line where there's income mean, and that the mean is technically $30,000. But you can see in the parentheses that the range is 35,000. And that what that means is that there are a couple of people who were outliers and earned over $150,000. So one of the protective factors that was conceptualized was this idea of connection to place. But well, I guess not, but, and in fact, nearly all participants, about 97%, reported a connection to place by answering very strongly agree, or agree very strongly, agree strongly, or agree. And so because of this lack of variation, I wasn't able to use it in subsequent analysis. When asked the question, how often have you personally observed or experienced the following environmental issues in Terrebonne Parish? You can see that environmental changes were very frequently observed, such as changes to the natural waterways, sinking of land, coastal erosion. And these changes in the environment were also described in the qualitative interviews, where participants called it, one participant called it the cancer of the land. Coastal erosion is a cancer of the land. Another participant talking about the soil erosion through the process of coastal erosion, said that looking at a bayou, said, we used to have land on both sides of this bayou. Now it's all open, it's all washed away, and it's getting worse every year. And another couple, this married couple, talked about pollution in the bayous from lack of oxygen. And they talked about how, like, after a heavy rainfall, the water got black, and the fish were just popping up. So the fish were dying with this lack of oxygen. And in addition to these chronic exposure to environmental changes, of course, there's repeated hurricanes, pollution from that results from hurricanes, and then people talked about discrimination as being a factor in a reason why they're experiencing so much environmental changes. So when asked about health, starting from the bottom line, in the last 30 days, how many days have you felt physically ill? On average, participants felt about 6 days in the last 30 days physically ill. And similarly, when asked in the last 30 days, have you felt emotional or mental illness, like depression, extreme sadness, anxiety? Again, it was about 6 days, just over about 6.5 days. However, in top line, looking at how many days in the last 30 days have you felt healthy and full of energy, you can see it's just over 1 day in the last 30 days. When looking at mental health using the many international neuropsychological or neuropsychiatric interview, screening, and diagnosis tool, you can see that in the light blue, 28% screened for general anxiety disorder, 14% screened for depression, and 24% screened for PTSD. Furthering those questions, getting to what would be a diagnosis. I don't have the ability to make a diagnosis, but questions that could lead a psychiatrist to diagnosis. 17% would qualify for general anxiety diagnosis, disorder diagnosis, 15% would qualify for depression diagnosis, and 4% would qualify for a PTSD diagnosis. And so of these four dependent variables, poor health days, poor mental health, and felt health impact, you could see that there is the poor health days, poor mental health and felt health impact were significantly related or correlated to exposure to environmental changes. And so participants wondered if changes in the environment, to include disasters and coastal erosion, were causing health conditions like sinus problems or allergies. And so in reference to that, one participant said, you would think that everybody that's dying down here, so it makes you wonder if our soils are not contaminated, or if our air is not contaminated, or something, and it's slowly killing everybody down here. In a regression, just looking at the poor mental health regression series, you can see that controlling for other factors in the model, for each year, an increase in age, participants' odds of meeting criteria for mental health diagnosis decreases by 5%. Females were 4 times as likely as males of meeting criteria for mental health diagnosis. Those who experienced discrimination were 5 times as likely as those who did not experience discrimination of meeting criteria for a mental health diagnosis. And for each unit increase in ethnic identity scale, participants' odds of meeting criteria for a mental health diagnosis increases by 85%. For each unit increase in social support, participants' odds of meeting criteria for a mental health diagnosis decreases by 14%. And finally, each unit increase in exposure to environmental changes, participants' odds of meeting criteria for a mental health diagnosis increases. And while technically the interaction between exposure, because I was looking for moderating model, exposure to environmental changes in ethnic identity, technically significant when graphed, the interaction is so far down the road that it actually did not even make sense to include it as something that could have a meaningful interpretation. So as mentioned earlier, discrimination was mentioned as part of explanations of why this was happening in their area, specifically to their people. And this comes because there's been this large history of discrimination. So displacement of Indigenous peoples from their original environments has been shown to disrupt access to clean water and fresh foods. And so Houma was initially at contact with the French, located up here, in case you're not familiar with the layout of Louisiana, by the north of Baton Rouge, the capital, and just on the Mississippi-Louisiana border. And if you happen to have had this kind of history in growing up, you would know that here in this area in Mississippi was where Choctaws and some Cherokee bands were removed from. So through the process of forced removal from first the French, then the Spanish, then the United States, our ancestors slowly moved down to the Gulf Coast. And as mentioned, there's these Indian schools that play a big role in current memories of understanding the world around participants. And I have this picture of the Congo Square because Congo Square, if you're not familiar, is located in the French Quarter in New Orleans. And today it's a place of celebration and jubilance to honor history. But prior to it being a place where slaves were sold and brutally massacred, the area, the land was actually a ceremonial site for Houma. And the only place that this is acknowledged in Louisiana's history is by this one plaque in the square. So as you know, I mentioned some of the causes is coastal erosion, but the cause of coastal erosion was expressed as drilling, damming, or dredging. And so the Mississippi was a very active place to get, and a huge transportation portal to get oil from the oil rigs off the Gulf Shore to other parts of the United States, and also to get shipment, to other countries. So oil fields started dredging through the marshland to have a faster route to the oil rigs. Instead of going out of the Mississippi and all the way around, they just started dredging through this marshland. And I'm guessing many of you are environmentalists or have environmental studies or engineering backgrounds. You know that whenever you cut through the marshland, you open up access for the salt water to come in and destroy that ecosystem. And another aspect is the damming process that simultaneously happened in Louisiana. A lot of the previous pathways of the Mississippi formed the bayous, and the replenishment of soil, of sediment, to build up the land, comes from the Mississippi. But as the oil field grew, the state and planners decided to dam these aspects of the Mississippi to remove that or to disrupt or take away the flow of the Mississippi in order to build housing and more facilities on those lands. And so simultaneously you have the dredging allowing saltwater access and the disruption of replenishment. And then because of this lack of overall planning, those who do subsistence activities or have done subsistence activities have had to change their practices from shrimping in a smaller boat or a smaller shrimp boat to these large vessels that require a vast amount of electronics that are expensive because they have to go further out into the Gulf, which means that they have to have some kind of freezing or cooling device, and they have to, sorry, my dog is rampaging through my room here. And these vessels have to carry a lot. And because they're so huge, when they're going through the bayous, they're lapping up more and more of the salt water that's in the bayous, further exacerbating the coastal or the soil erosion. And so putting this all together in a mixed methods way, you can see, I'm sorry, this is the qualitative part. So key findings of the phenomenological aspect show that there's the cyclical nature between the sociocultural events, the physical environmental changes and impacts. And these anthropogenic activities that have caused changes in the water have led to loss of availability of medicines because of the soil content being too salty, and harvesting ability in the water. And it's also then impacted health through loss of foods, specific foods that, not just specific foods, but just food, the ability to grow their own foods, their own healthy foods, and relying more on commodity foods. And so the less that the older generations are able to interact with the land, the less they're able to pass on cultural knowledge, because cultural knowledge has not been typically written down. It's been passed on to generations by doing, by harvesting, by collecting medicines, by teaching treater or healing methods through doing and interacting with the land. So these findings from the phenomenological are in this publication, and you can read further about it. in looking at this at a mix, like pulling these together, instead of doing a joint table display, mixed methods, display finding table, I decided to show it as it is in the cyclical nature. And so most of the phenomenological, or most of the survey results converged with the phenomenological findings. However, which was my hope, was that the qualitative results have revealed more information that is not measured in the survey. And some of that is this, this revealing of the loss of cultural knowledge and the ability to protect land that was not measured, and that we don't even have measures for still at this time. These findings supported my findings supported previous research that connects to sectoral impacts of agriculture and food security, biodiversity and natural ecosystems, all the way down through human rights issues. And then it also connected to previous research showing cultural and spiritual impacts, demographic impacts, changes and displacement of traditional lands and territories, etc. So this has led, of course, to more questions. So what is the extent, to what extent is there generational or regional difference in perceptions of these environmental changes? My study looked at just this one parish that was experiencing the most land loss, and that had the most participants, that have the most citizens who do subsistence activities as part of their livelihood or all of their livelihood, whereas other sectors in the tribe do not necessarily have those experiences. So is there a difference among their perceptions of environmental changes? What elements of environmental changes have led to grief, emotional illness, or declining mental health? While I was able to show that exposure, personal exposure, meaning observing and experiencing changes, has some kind of correlation or is related to these health outcomes. It's not really, I haven't been able to, with that particular data set, delineate which of those elements have more or less correlation or leading to these health outcomes, negative health outcomes. And then what is the role of culture in responding to and adapting to environmental changes? So I did ask about environmental changes, and the question was how likely are you to respond to, or to do any of these activities in response to your concerns about environmental changes? And the hypothesis was that there would be either 2 or 3 levels. Those are inside the community and those activities that are outside the community. These are individual level adaptations. Talking to friends or relatives, modifying your home, those kind of things, where they get to interacting more with outsiders, attending community meetings led by government officials, that kind of, those kind of responses. And in this initial study, there were, with a rotation method, these 2 factors. However, in my new study, where I only, of course, have at this moment 60 participants, it's not showing at this point in a difference in factors. Some of the adaptations that have been happening, because humans have been adapting to our climate since our existence. So indigenous peoples adapted just the same way, and our historical dwellings were made with the understanding that we do have disasters, we do have hurricanes, but we also have a lot of water. And so the roofs and the building materials were from the land that we lived in, and that can have a bit more ability to absorb and protect from those disasters. But they're also, in a way, cheaply made, not cheaply made, but like it is okay if it's less of a disruption, a personal disruption, if a hurricane comes and destroys the household, because the materials are there. But now we have these modern dwellings, we have these homes that we have a lot of attachment to the materials inside, and the materials are not necessarily from the land. And so they still get destroyed, the houses still get destroyed, but now there's a huge financial component to this disaster, or to this natural event that causes a disaster emotionally and financially among humans. For those living in the hurricane pathway, you might know that that insurances and FEMA play a large role in how buildings are now developed after a hurricane. So this yellow house is one that is an example for of restrictions and requirements in order to rebuild your home. So one, there's a requirement that you have to have your house 15, 12, or 8 foot above the land, and it goes by how close you are to the Gulf. And if you're over 8 feet, you have to have one of these electronic lift machines, regardless if you have anyone in your home that needs it or not. And participants really laugh at it because they say, okay, well, if it's supposed to help me get out in an emergency, it will not do that because it's electric, and will, like, when there's a flood, it comes in a flash, we're not going to be able to use it. I can continue to talk more about these adaptation strategies, but I really want to be able to get to your questions. And so I put up two links here that are government-led adaptation strategies that the state of Louisiana has decided to remove or relocate, in their terms, communities that they decided that they were no longer going to invest money in protecting the land, that therefore these communities should be removed. And so among the government, there's this lack of awareness of traditional ecological knowledge among these government planners, and that environmental injustices today are a re-traumatization of historical colonization efforts. And there's this lack of honoring tribal sovereignty, because these relocation efforts were made without communicating or consulting with the tribal governments. And among the United Houma Nation tribal community, there's this lack of awareness, I'm so sorry, of these macro adaptations or intervention activities. And there's this low willingness to participate in efforts that are from the state or federal government due to the discrimination that they've participated in or that they've experienced. So working with the tribal community, we are trying to develop community-based adaptation. And so in case you're not sure of the definition, it's community-based adaptations are focused on practical applications of adaptation activities. It uses participatory methods to empower communities to develop adaptation priorities and activities. And so we've done this in a couple of stages. One with this first study, we have the second study that's expanded to all districts of the tribe. We've done this intervention called Returning to Our Roots that incorporates traditional ecological knowledge into a traditional non-communicable disease or health activity, physical activity intervention. And we have this grant with National Academies of Science on culture, climate, and movement. The Returning to Our Roots intervention is outlined in this article, and we are in the process of collecting data for this National Academies of Science grant. So further research based on just these findings would look at the extent to which exposure impacts health and health disparities, what motivates individuals to take climate action or adaptation action. We don't really know how, there's migration movement measures, but looking at internal movement has been very difficult in this National Academies of Science study to measure. And then how can we move away from individualist to collective action to look at these land-based healing interventions? And how can we, or would it be effective if we expanded these land-based healing interventions to non-Indigenous peoples? And so I will end there. I know we only have 13 minutes left, but I look forward to any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Billiot. I think Professor Ching Wen wants to make some remarks, and I will call Gabriela for her question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Billiot, for this really critical and timing research. You know, as a lot of scientists are looking into climate change and seeking, adaptation strategies and understand what is community resilience, I think your research really give us really insights and different perspectives from, Indigenous people and the people who have suffered from, systemic racism, injustice, colonization processes from the past. Because I think we still have a lot of work to do to really, understand how those, past decisions have impacted community lives and their health and how they, move forward to the future, to resilience and for climate change, coping with climate change and sustainability. So I think this is really crucial. I think we often neglect the traditional knowledge, when we are looking into the technological solutions and this, science to try to resolve some environmental issues. So, in this network, it's about water, energy, food, and assets. But it is people who are underneath and as a foundation of those systems. Just really appreciate your work, and I'll open up to the questions now.
Thank you. We have, I think it's a comment or question from Gabriela Segovia. Please, if you can unmute yourself. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, I had actually written in the comments that there are a lot of native plant groups that are opening up in California to address restoring the land to its original state on the basis of strengthening the earth and the habitat, and ultimately to improve the conditions for animals and insects. But I also do not see the same approach being used when it comes to people. And so in seeing the work that it actually explained to me after I had asked the question, then there was more explanation from the presenter. But seeing if there was similar work being done elsewhere in Louisiana to strengthen the earth itself on which structures are being built for human habitation. I'm actually a lay person. I don't know, I'm not an ethnobotanist or, I don't do any of that stuff, but as we've quarantined, I've actually become more in tune with the land my house sits on and learning all about the soils, about the impact of different kinds of plants, learning how many chemicals other people use. I don't use any. And just, thinking about how if we took better care of the land, then it would take more care of us. I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that's going on right now with the earth has a lot to do with the impact we've had on it. And we're changing weather patterns, we're changing everything about it, around us. And so I'm really glad for the work that's being done here. I'm actually currently in discussions with a native plant society because they only focus on the plants, but they don't focus on the peoples, and a lot of the traditional ecology that's presented by people who have had generations of information passed down to them are not respected on the group. And so right now, that's the work that I'm doing as a layperson. I'm just saying, I'm kind of bridging the gap between the two groups right now. And it's not necessarily, I guess I don't consider myself an activist, but somehow I've gotten into this position. So I'm actually exploring a lot of different things. And this is one of the presentations that grabbed my attention because I think it speaks to a lot of what is going on with this group of not connecting the dots. So I wanted to thank you for this presentation and for the data, because that's one of the things that they do seem to need a lot of. So so thank you for that. And I guess it's more comments than question. I hope other folks have questions, and then I'll learn from that.
Well, thank you, Gabriella. And I love your picture. It like reminds me of like peacefulness, and then that, this tornado like way in the back. I don't know, it just speaks to me very, like that it's could always be there. I'm always thinking about disasters and how to prepare. So
Yeah, that's actually from the Four Corners, and it was a storm that we were driving away from, and we kept going and kept going. And so it's one of my favorite pictures that I took from driving in a car, and it was behind us, and I'm like, it's chasing us. And so I just took the picture.
thank you.
Great. So thank you very much. And we have a question. Sorry, I'm calling your names for you to ask the questions. Paige Warren.
Hi, thank you so much. This was such a fascinating presentation. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. Yeah, I was particularly fascinated with this connection between mental health and the environment and all of the different factors, but there's all sorts of other factors that you looked at that could increase or decrease. So where do you think kind of environmental restoration relative to some of those more direct interventions around health, how do you see those? What sort of interventions do you see coming, from your work?
Well, definitely we want to expand on this one that I didn't get a chance to talk about, is returning to our roots, because it incorporates traditional ecological knowledge as well as traditional or evidence-based, not traditional, evidence-based, interventions, in that we learn to communicate. The more we learn to communicate and learn from the land, the more that we can learn to care for ourselves. And there's this theory that we have our emotional stress reduces whenever we're in the environment. And the more you understand about and care for the environment, the more that stress decreases. And so I don't have, my own evidence for that. I just have, that's like the hypothesis at this moment. And that's what we're hoping to partly discover in our Returning to Our Roots intervention.
Thank you. That sounds fascinating.
Thank you, Paige. We have a question, one more question from David. David?
Yeah, my question was just like, how do you see this indigenous knowledge that is centered naturally around sustainability to inform like initiatives at the state level when, the environmental harms tend to be slow. It happens slow, it doesn't happen immediately, so there's not an urgency for policymakers to act on these problems.
That's a great question, and that actually kind of ties into the part about the government intervention that I didn't get a chance to fully discuss. But whenever the state of Louisiana decided to remove the indigenous communities without discussing it, the indigenous communities responded, and like very publicly. And so while that grant that Louisiana had from HUD for removal was awarded in 2015, no removal has actually taken place because they are still they being the government are still trying to get their heads around how to not just have indigenous peoples at the table, but to include their recommendations into the policy aspects. And so while in one respect that grant that they made from this colonial mindset that they're going to remove people was destructive emotionally, I think it has led to more of an inclusion of indigenous people's perspective into the state policy. And then this other work that I've done with the National Congress for American Indians, NCAI, has been working with the congressional members who developed the Climate Action Plan. And we, in a, 50, a team of 50 like indigenous leaders, indigenous government leaders, and researchers, community members, activists, developed a response, an indigenous response to the Climate Action Plan on how Congress can meaningfully incorporate indigenous knowledge and perspectives into their goals for climate action. Not to say that it's actually being done, but these are the things that from indigenous perspectives we're trying to do to incorporate indigenous knowledge into policy.
Thank you. I wanted to mention that actually I'm working in a project that we investigated with the school about how an indigenous community in Colombia located in a desertic and coastal area, they can adapt or prepare for a climate change, and they can be more resilient. And we did the research, but then it was a really nice project. So we, with a group of other 2 Colombian professionals, we decided to, okay, let's try to implement this. And when we tried to implement, we realized that definitely we needed to go, like, as you said, community-based adaptations and back to the roots. So we are basing our project in a strategy of a co-creation, and including circular economy, but mostly about co-creation, because we learned as we were speaking with people who have a lot of experience working with indigenous communities, that most of the projects don't, when they have the strategy to apparently to solve something like a climate challenge problem, but when they go there, they don't talk with the communities, they ignore the communities, and they say, oh, we will do this, but if the community is not engaged, it's not going to work. And sometimes the community has a lot of knowledge that can be utilized to develop the strategies. So I don't know if in your community-based adaptations you have discussed about co-creation.
Yeah, just add on that, our current urban planning and designs are all following the colonized kind of systems. So, I think it's very important that we don't perpetuate this process. And so that's why how we can decolonize our structure, our planning, our design, our education, our ways of designing and making those interventions. We really have to be really careful. Those investments coming in with policies and the fundings available, but we really don't want to, repeat the histories again. So I think this is really important to engage with community in a meaningful way and to really, develop those strategies moving forward. So thank you again for everyone's participation. I'll let Cecilia to
Shenandoah, thank you very much. It's very interesting. I know I have a lot of questions, but probably you can take it offline. We are going to have a concluding section next week with all our speakers. So if you have further questions, I encourage you to join next week. We are going to invite our speaker for this session back. So to have a more meaningful discussion about strategies and policy making, how we can be more inclusive in terms of decision making and involvement of the communities in any kind of decision making process. Thank you very much for your participation, and thank you, Shannon, for finally make it. And we enjoy having your dog as well to cheer on. And I wish everybody a very, very happy and safe long weekend. And I hope to see you next week. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was incredible.